Hello, my name is Amanda Glosson, and I've been pushing pixels around screens for over 10 years now. The last 3 of those, as was just mentioned, have been spent as a front-end engineer at Salesforce. I'm here to speak with you today about fostering empathy for one another as developers and how a foundation rooted in empathy can help us write usable, reusable, extensible, and maintainable code together. To start things off, let's define what empathy is. Empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. So, here's you live on Mars, and here's a chicken farmer from Earth. And if someone were to ask you to empathize with this person, they might say something like, imagine yourself in their shoes, or imagine how it would feel if you were in their situation. So you imagine what it would be like for you to be a chicken farmer on Mars. And this only gets you one step of the way there, right? Empathy isn't imagining yourself in their situation. Empathy is imagining what it's like for them to be in their own shoes. Our difficulty in imagining what it's like to be that other person has a lot to do with how much shared context we have. As a front-end engineer, it's easy for me to empathize with someone struggling to create something like some email templates versus me trying to empathize with someone struggling with multi-threading in Java. I have far more points of reference with the first one than with the second. But that certainly doesn't make empathizing with the multi-threader less important. It just means that I have to put a bit more work into imagining what it's like to be them and in their situation. It will require more empathizing on my part to bridge those gaps in understanding. So who should we be empathizing with? We're empathizing with people building email templates and people multi-threading, but who else should we be empathizing with? As developers, we should be empathizing with everyone affected by the code that we produce. So who are these people? These people can be broken down into 3 separate groups. We have our teammates, our code consumers, and our end users. Your teammates are typically the smallest group of people that we're going to talk about, but they're the group of people that are most affected by the software that you write. When you're solving problems, these people will usually have a context that's much closer to your own, making it much easier to write empathetic code for them. Also, if you miss the mark here, these people usually have the opportunity to ask you questions and to give you constructive feedback on how to make your code better. Code consumers are the people who build on top of what you have built. A good example of this is maybe you work on a JavaScript framework, and then other developers use that framework as a service to build new services and other end products. There may not be any expectation that this group of people is working in the same subject area as you or your team. They could have a totally different context than you do. Instead of being able to easily ask you questions or give you immediate feedback, this group of people might only have your code, and hopefully they have a bit of your documentation too, to fully understand the problems that you're trying to solve with your delivered code. The last group of people affected by your code are end users. And these are people who are using applications or services that you or the people consuming your code have built. This group's probably the largest group of people affected by you, and they probably have the least amount of shared context. An end user here might mean another developer consuming a service, or it might mean someone using an end piece of software like a website. So to use the same example as before, let's say you work on a JavaScript framework and someone builds a website using your framework, and there's this end user out there who's using that website. I won't get into fully addressing it here, but with this group of users, we also need to start thinking about how to provide full accessibility and empathetic user interfaces for these people. And it's also worth mentioning that the code you write here could be helping or hindering the ease of implementation of those specific features. So at this point, we know what empathy is, and we've identified some groups of people that we should be empathizing with when we write our code. But there are reasons to do this outside of just generally being nice to those people affected by the code that we write. Why is empathy important to software engineering? Well, it's important because we still have some really big problems to solve, and until some team solves the problem of simulating the human brain, we need teams of people with diverse backgrounds and diverse knowledge, teams with this small amounts of shared context to be able to come together and solve those problems. And like we talked about earlier, low amounts of context require a higher amount of empathy. So let's imagine one of these big problems. So maybe we think about simulating a human brain, like we mentioned earlier. It's a pretty big problem. So think about that, and we need to put together a team of people to solve this problem. What would the ideal group of people look like? To me, I think it might look something like this. The large triangle is the entire area of our problem. Each smaller triangle represents the knowledge that a teammate brings to the table. Notice that none of these overlap, and they perfectly cover the entire surface of the problem. This team has all the knowledge that they need to solve the problem, but they'll need a lot of empathy to work together to develop a solution. Let's imagine that someone on this team wrote some code similar to this, and take a moment to talk about how someone without context might try to figure out what the variable cat ends up getting set to. So I think we're talking about brains here, but cats are animals, and mentions pets, and cats are pets too. Cat can mean category. Cat can mean catalyst. Maybe we're thinking about brain chemicals. It can also mean catamaran, but okay, let's stay focused. We're probably not talking about boats here. We're talking about brains. And it's coming from the scans object. So cat, we can maybe assume, is a CAT scan. I had to do a lot of mental work here to get to what I think the code is trying to tell me, while also having some percentage of uncertainty about what I'm actually getting with this variable cat. On the flip side of that, let's take a look at a different kind of team. On this team, all the members have the exact same set of knowledge in the exact same context as everyone else on the team. Someone on this team writes out this function. Everyone immediately understands. It passes code review. It gets checked into the code base. But when another developer on another team finds this code and they don't have any context of what's going on, they don't know what this means, what is TFW. And I'm hoping that there's maybe a few people in the audience who are looking at this who also have no idea what this means. This is that feel when a plan comes together. To be fair, in these two separate examples, we're talking about what has been quoted as being one of the most difficult challenges in computer science, according to Phil Carlton. And I'm obviously not talking about cache and validation here. Naming things is one of the most difficult things for us because of the mismatches we encounter in context and in knowledge. Also, in real-world cases, this is made even more difficult because we're rarely describing things that map to real-world objects. Probably not talking about boats or cars. We're going to be naming abstract concepts that exist just to organize code. Maybe these naming conventions that you use will be easily understood by someone who's an expert in design patterns, but this won't describe everyone affected by your code. Now, in these two very trivial code samples that we just looked at, poor naming and the lack of any documentation made it so either a teammate or a code consumer couldn't easily use the code written. In both instances, the coder didn't really think about those who would be using it, and it sort of fell apart. Oh, goodness. So let's go back to the cat example and see what it would take to improve it. So here we are back in our cat example, and we've talked to the developer who wrote this, and we now know that scans are brain scans for sure, and that PID is actually the ID of the parent who had the scans done. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of documentation. So used to describe and access a patient's brain scans. Okay, that makes sense. Scans objects now represent brain scans, and the PID is now clearly a patient ID. But we still have this nebulous variable cat floating around, and we have the scans object, which could conflict if we had any other kind of medical scans. So let's see if we can clarify on some of these points. Okay, so we made a bunch of name changes. So now things are looking a little bit clearer and readable, maybe even usable. But we're also starting to get kind of verbose, like we have patient brain scans and patient cat scans. And I'm going to argue that this is actually okay. Certainly you want to use your own discretion here, but naming things is hard, and we want to provide readable code to our fellow developers. Generally, in a production environment, all of our comments are going to be stripped out and our code's going to be minified anyways. So the code that goes into production is what's made for computers to read, and the code that we write by hand is meant for our fellow developers to read. So I say feel free to add in those extra characters where it makes sense. At this point, what we're talking about is starting to toe the line of what makes usable, reusable, extensible, and maintainable code, and what is just simply your coding style. And I don't care what your coding style is, but just make sure that that style includes empathy. Usability, reusability, extensibility, maintainability. These are all things that come up when we start talking about coding best practices and conventions. And as it turns out, these coding conventions and best practices are generally rooted in developer empathy, although they rarely seem to be presented that way. Prior to thinking about this talk, I haven't even really considered it. And to be honest, my first thought was, oh, well, I guess some people do get upset when lines are longer than 80 characters. And this is a very narrow thought, and it was because the best practices that have been presented to me were usually in the context of the development speed of a project. We have ways of measuring development speed and a project's overall velocity, but we don't have any good measures for the quality of code that we're working in or the level of empathy that it has. This can make our other metrics seem pretty cold and anything but empathetic. However, best practices enhance the speed of our development because it makes the code empathetic. Our fellow developers are able to dive into our code, quickly discover its intent, and can feel reasonably confident in knowing what the code's used for, how to reuse it, how to extend it, and also how to maintain it. Features can be added faster, regressions can be avoided, and bugs can be squashed quicker. In the real world, our teams will never look like this. or this. They're going to look something more like this, where at any given time, some developers on a team have some shared knowledge and context, while some don't. This will change daily as teammates grow and learn, or the problem itself evolves. As long as humans are the ones still developing software instead of our brain simulations, we will need empathy to bridge gaps in context, to bring together developers with wide differences in knowledge and context, and come together and create solutions to some really big problems. Companies have entire teams of people dedicated to our end users. Teams researching, designing, and testing out user interfaces to create empathetic user experiences. I hope that as developers, we can expand this passion for user experiences and empathetic design into our software development practices. After all, user interfaces aren't the only interfaces that should be frictionless, and end users aren't the only ones who deserve our empathy, because interfaces rule everything around us, and we're people too. Thanks.